Okay, so today we are going to talk about financial and economic bubbles. Sound familiar? With the meteoric rise of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, along with global equity markets reaching giddy all-time highs, we thought it was high time we explored this a little bit more. What they are, how they form, what the warning signs to look for are, and how to avoid them. Certainly, as history has shown, the bigger the bubble is, the louder the bang tends to be, and the fallout is felt by many. So listen up. We are joined today from America by none other than Dr. Donald Rapp, author of the aptly titled Bubbles, Booms and Busts, The Rise and Fall of Financial Asset Classes, in addition to a whole host of other titles, including Human Missions to Mars and the Use of Extraterrestrial Resources for Human Space Missions to Moon or Mars. Wow, I think we should really stick focused on bubbles today. Dr. Rapp, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
And I'm very happy to be here.
Great. So, read your work. Very, very interesting. I've just actually finished the book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, which is, of course, by Charles Mackay. So in terms of bubbles in play at the moment, which ones do you consider there to be?
Well, as I said a few moments ago before we began the program, I have charted this current bubble, and I would have thought that it would have collapsed a long time ago. And the fact that it's so persistent, it's so powerful, it keeps going, it resists any attack, has made me wonder whether indeed it's truly a bubble or it's a rise to a new plateau. And perhaps it's a new way of dealing with money and the economy, and maybe the old pictures of bubbles isn't going to work here.
So you're talking about Bitcoin, aren't you? Sorry. You're talking about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. Yeah?
Well, the Bitcoin bubble is certainly a bubble, but it will collapse, and in fact it bounces up and down by huge amounts. But what Bitcoin is leading into is the question of how money is generated and distributed. And right now, the way that money is generated is by banks issuing loans. And Bitcoin is part of a movement to try to develop a medium of exchange that bypasses the banks and just allows people to exchange sales by means of a medium essentially on the internet that bypasses the banks. And I suppose that might be the future, but I can't predict that.
Well, do you not think that a lot of people who've bought Bitcoin might be missing the point when actually the technology underpinning it is a blockchain where all the transactions are carried out, whereas people are actually buying the coin, which is the byproduct of it? It's very much like people, for example, let's just say that the checkbook is just being invented. People, instead of buying shares in the company that's invented the checkbook, they're just buying lots and lots of checkbooks.
I guess you're right. I haven't studied Bitcoin that much myself, but I do think that yes, you can either buy the company that issues it, or you can buy the currency itself. And apparently, the currency is more speculative than the company.
Mm. Yeah, I could certainly say that. I mean, I think it's either Neocoin or Ripple where people can actually buy shares in the company, which seems to be the answer, certainly if the bull wave of cryptocurrencies continues. But just going back to your research, Donald, I mean, what would you say the telltale signs for investors are that they are, in fact, investing in a bubble rather than an asset class that still has intrinsic value?
Well, in one of the figures in my book, it shows the evolution of a bubble. There's always some very reasonable and logical reason for a bubble to develop. For example, in the 1920s, there was the advent of widespread electrification, automation of factories, the availability of cars. It offered a vision of a future in the 1920s of a movement away from an agrarian to an industrial society, and that fueled the stock market, but not just the stock market, the actual indices of industrial production rose dramatically during the 1920s. It was not just a boom in the stock market, it was a boom in the entire economy. The problem with it was that people became so enthusiastic about this potential for growth that they bid up the prices of stock far beyond where that proper and natural growth should have led them. And at some point along the way, John Kenneth Galbraith, 50 years ago, described this in detail. But at some point along the way, this right and proper and natural enthusiasm for the future, such as we had in the dot-com era, the belief that the internet and dot-coms were going to revolutionize the world, at some point along the way, the people buying stock are no longer buying stock because of this great potential for the future, but they're buying stock because it's going up. And at that point, there's a transition from buying for the potential of growth into buying for the rise in stock. And then at that point, it's going up because it's going up. It's not going up because there's potential for growth, because people are buying to hold and sell at a higher price. And at that point, it becomes a bubble. And once it reaches that point, usually, historically in the past, at some point along the way, that bubble's going to break. And when the bubble pops, usually there's some international event, some event or a thing that happens that acts as a trigger to get us started. But it's built into the system that already all these people buying and buying and buying with the expectation that they can sell at a higher price suddenly lose the faith, and then the whole thing plummets. And the classical picture of this is a sort of sawtooth where it gradually grows and grows and grows and grows, and when it drops precipitously. And we've seen this happen over and over again. And the odd thing about the present stock market is that it seems to be lasting too long. And it makes me wonder.
Well, it's hubris, would it be fair to say? I mean, you say in your book that bubbles start when expectations for quick returns outrun the reality. And the stock markets around the world have been absolutely giddy and seemingly peddling hot air and seem to know no limits. And certainly, as you quite rightly said, bubbles seem to have repeated throughout history. We've had the Mississippi bubble, the South Sea bubble, tulipomania in the Netherlands, the property bubble more recently, the dot-com bubble, and arguably cryptocurrency. But why do these keep on repeating? Do people not learn?
Well, there's a very natural human greed as a fundamental human tendency. And it's a good way to make money fast, and it's worked. I mean, a lot of people have made a lot of money these past few years, and it works. That's why people do it. It works till it doesn't work. There's one other factor here, and that is the matter of the Federal Reserve pumping money into the economy. This is not a new idea. It's been around for 100 years. That the Federal Reserve is like a pump, and the banks are like spigots. And the Federal Reserve is, if you use the water analogy, the Federal Reserve is pumping water, actually money, through the banking system to the banks, and that money goes out into the economy, and it's got to go somewhere. And it turns out that in terms of buying products and services, the rate of buying products and services doesn't change that much from year to year. So all this extra money that's available has to go somewhere. And it's kind of like if you had a plumbing system and your pump was pumping more and more water through the system, it has to flow somewhere. So it flows into the real estate market and it flows into the stock market. And we have a bubble in the real estate market as well. And in fact, right now, we seem to be in the same boat that we were in 2007, 2008. The one big difference is that we don't have the prevalence of the mortgage situation where so many fragile mortgages were issued based on thin air. So although there is a bubble in real estate, there's not a bubble in the mortgage market. And so that makes it more stable. But all that money is pumped into the economy, and it's got to end up somewhere, and it's ended up in the stock market and the real estate markets. So when, an issue of debate that's been around for a long time is when they compute inflation, should they include the price of housing and the price of stocks? Now, for someone that already has a house or someone that already owns stocks, the inflation is not a problem. In fact, it's a benefit because they've increased their value. Their assets have gone up. But for new entries into the market, young people that have to buy a house or young people that have to buy stock to put away for the future, the prices escalated far beyond their affordability. And so we have a duality here where the real rate of inflation for people in the older generation who are already invested is very different than it is for the newer generation.
It really is. They've had it so good. The baby boomers, for example, I mean, property and stocks have gone in one direction ever since the 1950s, by and large. Whereas certainly for people graduating from college or university now, certainly in the UK, they've found it harder than ever to get onto the property ladder. But I mean, with regards to the money supply, as you say, being pumped into stocks and the housing market indirectly via quantitative easing, which are policies that have been implemented by not just the US but the UK and European governments as well. How do you find that this bubble is going to burst? Do you think it's going to slowly deflate as and when interest rates increase like they already are in the US and the UK?
Historically, bubbles have not slowly deflated. Historically, bubbles have precipitously dropped. And usually there's some sort of spark. For example, if North Korea exploded a nuclear bomb over the Pacific Ocean, maybe the stock market would drop 6,000 points right then and there in one day. So it'll be some international event, something that's unpredictable, a great earthquake, who knows what. When it drops, once it gets going, the same forces that drove the market up, the expectation of quick profits is going to, greed will turn into fear. Of course, you know that CNN has a greed fear index, and right now we're heavily toward the greed side, but it can easily turn in the opposite direction. But as far as money supply is concerned, what economists have finally figured out now in the 21st century is that the key to apparent prosperity seems to be to keep an abundant money supply. Now, traditionally, the fear had always been that if you had an abundant money supply, that would end up creating runaway inflation. So the Federal Reserve has always been very tentative about increasing the money supply because of the fear of inflation. What we seem to have today, and I'm not sure anyone understands it, is a situation where there's an adequate and abundant money supply, an excessive money supply, yet the inflation hasn't run away from us. And so in a way, that's very good. Now, the other aspect of it is debt. We have a debt-driven economy, and what we have found is that is that, way back in the 1920s and 30s, it was widely believed that the key to economic balance and prosperity was to balance the books. And one of the terrible things they did in the 1930s was to try to balance the books on the federal government instead of running a deficit to try to pull themselves out of the Depression. And right now, we're in a perennial period of running a deficit, and we seem to be able to get away with it. I mean, look at it this way. The government has $20 trillion worth of debt. Actually, it's only $14 trillion to the public, and $6 trillion is internal. But with all that debt, people are still willing to lend money to the federal government at 2.5% to 2.8%, which is in itself remarkable.
It is, and certainly the Federal Reserve. I mean, they're about as federal as Federal Express. I mean, they were. 1913, the US dollar's value has decreased by 95%, which is quite staggering, really, and that is no small measure down to inflation. So I guess it has crept in over the long run. So you feel, going back to what we're saying about bubbles suddenly bursting, you'd say that if we were to see the bubble collapse, it would be down to a single event, not just a chain of events?
I believe a single event would probably be the trigger, sure. But I'm not a soothsayer, and I can't predict the future. All I can say is the way it's always worked is that once it started downward, it dropped precipitously. We'll have to see how that works. I don't know. Go ahead.
How much of this do you think is actually down to the media? I mean, it would seem that these recessions, these blips are generally self-fulfilling prophecies. Once the media have gotten wind of a negative news report or an economic number, that it all kind of spirals out of control, and then people suddenly panic, and then fears of a recession are overtly more of a reality.
I'm not sure that's relevant here. The people who invest seem to be impervious to the media. We had an event only a few weeks ago where the stock market, Dow Jones, dropped 1,000 points in one day, and money poured back into the stock market. So the media blew it up, and it didn't go anywhere. I think the stock market is going to continue to prosper until some international event causes a total change in the psychological attitude.
Well, Donald, let's hope that talks with North Korea and Donald Trump bear some fruit. So moving on, I mean, the biggest casualties of bubbles, would it be fair to say, are generally the last entrants into the market, i.e. Known as the cannon fodder. This is no real different from normal market dynamics, where the smart money tends to invest and divest before the last people into the market all pile in.
Absolutely. There's the old joke about the guy that calls up his broker and says, "I want to buy some shares of this small stock," and the broker says, "Well, it's 10." He says, "Buy me 1,000 shares." So he calls up his broker the next day, and he says, "How's the stock doing?" "Well, it's up to 12." So he says, "Buy me another 1,000 shares." So he calls him the next day and he says, "How's it doing?" And he says, "It's up to 15. He says, "Buy me another 1,000 shares." And he keeps doing that. And finally, when the stock reaches 30, he says to his broker, "Sell the whole lot at 30. And the broker says, "To who?" But the point is that I think that the psychology has got to reach the fever pitch. And right now, we probably haven't got the fever pitch. I don't know that we're emulating what happened in 2007 when people were buying houses. Buying a house is a big deal, and they were buying houses to sell in 1 year. They were buying stocks to sell in 1 week, and it was just a feverish process of buying and selling and buying and selling. People were buying things they didn't even know what they were buying. And in my book, for example, I have some .com stock prices, some charts that show exponential rises and exponential collapses. So we seem to be in a bubble, but it's not a feverish bubble. It doesn't have the same character as we had in 2006 and 2007. It seems more restrained, and therefore maybe it has more stability.
Well, that's in general terms, but certainly looking at Bitcoin, I know you've been out of the loop for a couple of years, but when it comes to Bitcoin, before Christmas, when prices, as you say, reached a critical fever pitch of $20,000 a coin, and the last stock trading day before Christmas, I know Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency and trades every day of the week. What was interesting is that the price crashed by about 30%. And this was just before Christmas, where the smart money, I would imagine, would be quietly divesting whilst the world and his wife would be busy preparing for Christmas. And now Bitcoin is at 8,637. So based on that kind of fall of more than 50%, would you say that's as near as damn it to a crash or bubble bursting?
Oh, certainly. But don't forget, the whole reason for having cryptocurrencies is to bypass the current system of generating money. And here's the problem with the current system. You go to the bank, you say you want to borrow $1,000. The bank says, fine, and we put $1,000 in your account. That $1,000 did not exist. They just created it. Now, that's fine. They created $1,000, but they say you have to pay us 5% interest per year to repay that loan. But they didn't create the 5% for the interest. They only created the $1,000. So where's the 5% going to come from? Okay, it's $50 interest per year, but the $50 was never created. So there's a fundamental problem in the money system, because the banks create the money, but the banks do not create the interest money to repay the interest on the loans. As a result, the only way that you can find the money to repay the loan plus the interest is to keep taking more loans. So the banks have to keep generating more money, and the money supply has to keep increasing with the interest rate. For example, if the interest rate on bank loans were 5%, then the money supply would have to increase by 5% every year. Otherwise, the banks could not get repaid. And what happens is that when we get into a stall in the economy where it's not expanding and the money supply is not expanding enough to pay back the loans, then you get into a recession. And so this periodic cycle in the economy is fundamentally due to the way we generate money. And what cryptocurrencies are trying to do is to bypass that whole thing and say, okay, I have a good, you have a good, I want to trade those between you and me, and we can have a currency that allows us to do that in fair trade without the problem of the banks. And that's why cryptocurrencies have a great appeal. But the question is, how do you transition from a bank-generated money system to a cryptocurrency system. And is in almost anything in life, when you have a transition from one system to another, you always have difficulties during the transition period.
Well, that's going to be a very interesting transition if it ever happens. I mean, the governor of the Bank of England even said last week that they are not going to have anything to do with cryptocurrency whatsoever. And I think that caused Bitcoin to fall in the moment. Okay, so... sorry, carry on.
Yeah, of course, cryptocurrencies are an attack on the banks. And of course, the banks are not going to cooperate.
They will talk it down as much as they can, no doubt. So what do you predict the next bubble to be? The current one in which we're in terms of real estate? But what's next?
I think that there are many problems here, and they're working in parallel. I think that one of them is free trade. I think free trade has moved a lot of industry out of the. I'm thinking of the United States, but I'm sure it's true of the United Kingdom as well. Has moved all this industry out of the United States, and we've become buyers. And I was at a seminar not so long ago where an advocate of free trade was giving a talk. And somewhere in the middle of his talk, he was saying, you know, France will produce this, and Great Britain will produce that, and Italy will do this, and Germany will do that. And someone in the audience yelled out from the audience, "What will the United States do?" And someone else in the audience yelled out, "Consume." And therein, I think, lies the problem that free trade has more or less been a great boon to all the developing countries, because they can produce goods cheaper because they underpay the workers. But what does it mean for the more industrialized nations? And I think free trade is going to create a situation where the industrialized nations are no longer tenable. About all they're able to do is buy goods, but they're not going to be producing much. I think we produce a monster in China. And everyone's worried about North Korea. I think China is much more worrisome.
Well, that's
free
true.
Trade is part of the picture.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, for a very long period of time, I mean, China were supplying cheap goods to America, and America, fueled by credit and loans, were very happy to buy, which was a false economy. Would it be fair to say?
I believe it can't last. I believe it's a temporary thing, and I think that Trump, for all his craziness, is really correct. I think he's right about free trade. I think he's right about immigration. And I think that he's the only one who's willing to bring these critical issues on the table. Unfortunately, he's a very bad manager. It's unprecedented that any president would publicly criticize his cabinet members when all he has to do is fire them, and he's fired plenty, and he's obviously mismanaged his office. But he does have the right idea about some of the problems facing America, and some of those same problems, I'm sure, face the European nations. The influx of immigrants, the loss of industry to underpaid nations, and I don't know where it's going to end. But in any event, coming back to the point, I think cryptocurrencies are probably 20, 30 years from now going to become commonplace and widely used. I think we're going to have a lot of growing pains, and people, once again, like in any bubble, there's an expectation, a real, honest, and logical expectation of great growth. That's what we had in the 1920s. with electrification, cars, and industrialization. That's what we had in the dot-com bubble. It was real. The dot-com has revolutionized the world, but it got ahead of itself. And I think the same thing is true about cryptocurrencies. It's real. It's a great opportunity. It will grow, and I believe the banks are doomed, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, and it's going to be a long, hard road to get that installed as the system.
But going back to what you said about the dot-com bubble about 17 years ago, when there are only a few survivors, for example, Amazon and eBay, do you predict that Bitcoin could be equated to being the gold of cryptocurrencies, and that, okay, potentially in 10, 20 years' time, a lot of the new ones entering onto the scene now, or shall I say exploding onto the scene, will probably fizzle out, where Bitcoin, the first and biggest one, will potentially have the longevity to make it through?
They seem to have the inside track. They're widely known, and yes, I think there's a great opportunity there. I think they probably will become a dominant force and in the cryptocurrency world, and I think that world is going to grow. But it's not going to be a straight line from here to there.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what the G20 say and do about cryptocurrency. All they have to do really is have a meeting and decide to shut it all down, and that's my concern for cryptocurrency in the future. If governments are in cahoots with each other and decide just simply it's too much of a threat to central banks and their grip on control, so they decide just to block it, and they can do that via the internet, just block it. Like some countries block various sites, like China, the G20, and the Western world may decide to do that with cryptocurrencies. That's always a threat, isn't it? Would it be fair to say?
I suppose that's possible. I wouldn't know. I think sometimes it's very, not sometimes, but always, it's very hard in the early stages to imagine how much growth can occur. If you go back to any of the companies like Apple or Microsoft or whatever, and go back to the beginning, could you foretell the great growth that those companies were going to go through? So I'm not sure we can perceive what the opportunity is there, but I just have a deep-rooted gut feeling that cryptocurrencies will become very, very important over the next 2 or 3 decades.
Well,
unfortunately, I won't be around to observe it because I'm 83 years old.
Oh, don't say never. Well, regardless, I think a lot of cryptocurrency investors listening will be delighted to hear your kind of prediction for what the future may behold. So Donald, we're running out of time, but thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to share your insights. It's been very interesting. Lastly, if people want to find out more about you and your work, where can they find you?
Well, I have a website, and unfortunately the website is sort of out of date, so I almost hate to give it, but let me give you my email address, and anyone that would like to communicate with me, I would be happy to respond. I'm usually quite responsive to emails, especially serious ones. So I guess you already have my email, but I'll give it again. It's DRAPP. That's one word, DRAPP, Dr. D. Rapp, at earthlink.net. And anyone that is interested in communicating with me, I'd be happy to respond as quickly as I could.
Fantastic. Well, Donald, prepare yourself for an influx of emails.